If you're so smart, then translate it. 12 interpreters failed, but the janitor spoke up. 8 languages. Liora Ashford was pushing her cleaning cart down the marble hallway of Summit Tower in Manhattan. Her gray uniform wrinkled, her rubber-soled shoes worn thin, her calloused hands gripping a dirty mop handle when she heard the shouting coming from the main conference room on the top floor. It was late at night, but the lights were still blazing behind those heavy oak doors, and that meant trouble. 12 interpreters had been fired that evening, every single one of them unable to correctly translate the contract documents that would save Steele Holdings from losing a $200 million deal with the most powerful Japanese investor on the Pacific Rim. That's when Vance Steele, the man who ran the most feared organization on the entire East Coast, a man whose name alone could empty a room, slammed his fist on the conference table and shouted at the 13th interpreter who'd just walked in, trembling. "If you're so damn smart, then translate this contract right because Nakamura's about to walk. And if he does, I promise you, you won't be the only one who disappears tonight." Liora stopped mopping. Through the crack in the door, she could see them, the desperate executives in their $10,000 suits huddled around the table. Bennett Cross rubbing his temples, Selene Kessler scribbling notes with a clenched jaw, Gideon Hale sitting with his arms crossed and that permanent sneer on his face. And on the massive screen mounted on the wall, the elderly Japanese investor, Kenji Nakamura, sitting motionless, his expression shifting from patience to something that looked a lot like goodbye. She recognized that look. She'd seen it before on doctors' faces, on landlords' faces, on the faces of every person who'd ever given up on her. "Kenji no Ida," she whispered without realizing she'd spoken out loud, the Japanese word slipping from her lips like a secret she'd been keeping for 6 long years. The room went dead silent. Every single pair of eyes turned toward the door where Liora stood frozen in her faded gray uniform, a mop in one hand and a spray bottle in the other, her thin frame barely filling the doorway, dark hair tucked under a cotton cap and those sharp gray-green eyes, the ones nobody in that building had ever bothered to look into, now locked on the contract displayed on the secondary monitor near the entrance. Vance Steele turned his head slowly, and for the first time in 6 years of walking past her every single night without a glance, he actually saw her. If you're enjoying this story, do me a favor and hit that like button. It means more than you know. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't already, subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Because what Liora said in that conference room didn't just save a $200 million deal. It changed everything. And I mean everything. Vance Steele didn't shout. He didn't need to. He simply looked toward the door and spoke 2 words in a voice so low it sounded like a knife slicing through silk. "Bring her in." The 2 black-suited bodyguards standing on either side of the door stepped aside, and Liora Ashford, still holding a mop in her left hand and a glass spray bottle in her right, crossed the threshold of the boardroom for the first time in 6 years, not to clean the floor. Her worn rubber-soled shoes made a very soft sound against the black marble, but in that silence, it landed like a drumbeat. Gideon Hale was the first to break it. He leaned back in his leather chair, folded his arms across his chest, looked Liora up and down, then let out a laugh he didn't bother to hide. "Is this a joke? A janitor?" His voice echoed through the room, and Liora felt the weight of every word pressed down on her shoulders. But she didn't lower her head. She was used to being looked through, but being looked down on was different, and she'd learned long ago that people could only diminish her if she allowed it. Selene Kessler set her pen down on the table and turned to Gideon with a stare so cold it made him stop laughing. "Let her speak," Selene said, her voice calm but hard as steel. And in that moment, Liora remembered why. Over the past 6 years, out of everyone in that building, Selene Kessler was the only one who always looked her straight in the eye when she said good evening. On the massive screen, Kenji Nakamura leaned forward, his narrow, sharp eyes squinting as if appraising a rare painting in an auction house. He spoke in Japanese slowly and clearly. Do you understand Japanese? Liora rested the mop against the wall, set the spray bottle on the floor, then walked to the conference table where a contract more than 50 pages thick lay open among cold cups of coffee and expensive ballpoint pens. She picked up the documents and her calloused fingers flipped through the pages at a speed no one in the room had expected. "Hi, wakarimasu," she answered Kenji in Japanese, so precise that Bennett Cross lifted his head from his hands, where he'd been rubbing his temples, and stared at her as if she were a ghost. Liora stopped at page 17, then page 32, then page 48, and each time she paused, the air in the room grew heavier. "Here," she said, placing her finger on the first clause. "The translation states that Steele Holdings will supply construction materials for 5 projects, but Mr. Nakamura's original Japanese text clearly specifies 50 projects. That's not a minor error. That's a discrepancy of more than $80 million. Bennett Cross went pale. Gideon Hale uncrossed his arms. Selene Kessler began taking notes furiously. "Here." Liora turned to page 32. The interpreter translated the completion deadline as a groundbreaking deadline, meaning you believe you have 18 months to begin construction. But in reality, Mr. Nakamura is giving you 18 months to complete everything. Those are 2 entirely different things. And if you sign this version, you'll be in breach of contract from the very first day. Bennett Cross shot to his feet as if shocked by electricity. "That's impossible," he whispered. "And here," Liora flipped to page 48, her voice still as calm as if she were reading a grocery list while the boardroom shook around her. "The insurance clause. The translation says the insurance only covers workplace accidents, but the original includes environmental damage as well, meaning if any pollution incident occurs at the Atlantic City site, Steele Holdings will bear the full cost with no cap. And given the scale of this port casino project, we're talking about a figure that could reach 9 figures. Silence followed. Not the silence of peace, but the silence after a bomb has gone off, when everyone is waiting to see whether the building will collapse. On the screen, Kenji Nakamura nodded slowly, and for the first time that evening, he smiled just slightly, but enough for everyone in the room to understand that the woman holding the mop had been right about every single word. Vance Steele hadn't spoken since ordering her brought in. He stood at the head of the table, both hands braced against the black oak surface, his bottomless dark eyes never leaving Liora for even a second. She felt that gaze, heavy as lead, hot as embers, and she knew that in Vance Steele's world, his attention wasn't a reward but a test, and those who failed it rarely got a second chance. He spoke just one sentence, but the way he delivered it, slow, each word deliberate, as if each were a bullet being loaded into a chamber, made the entire room hold its breath. "Who are you?" Liora didn't answer right away. She looked down at her hands, at fingers roughened by cleaning chemicals, at knuckles cracked from cold water in the early hours. Then she looked up and met the gaze of Vance Steele, the man who had just asked who she was, in a voice that could make an entire city bow its head. And she understood that this moment would change everything. Either she would go back to pushing her cleaning cart through marble corridors as if tonight had never happened, or she would tell the truth and never again be able to return to being invisible. "I'm the one who listened," Liora said, her voice soft but steady like a thin steel wire that nothing could bend. "For 6 years, I've cleaned these rooms. For 6 years, I've listened to you talk on the phone, negotiate, argue, celebrate, swear. I heard Mr. Cross call the bank late at night. I heard Miss Kessler reread contracts out loud to herself when she thought no one was left. I heard Mr. Hale badmouth his colleagues in the break room when he believed only the coffee machine was listening. Gideon Hale flushed but didn't dare open his mouth." Selene Kessler looked up from her notes, her sharp eyes fixed on Liora with something that wasn't pity, but almost recognition. "But listening doesn't explain your perfect Japanese," Bennett Cross said, still standing by the conference table, his face pale after 3 shocks in a row. "Where did you learn it? Who were you before you came here?" Liora drew a deep breath. She looked at Selene, the only woman in the room who had ever seen her when she was invisible, and Selene gave a slight nod, a gesture so small that no one else might have noticed it. But Liora did, and it was enough for her to say what she had buried for 6 years beneath a gray uniform and the smell of disinfectant. "I graduated from Columbia University," she said, and the sentence fell into the boardroom like a stone dropped into still water. "Applied linguistics. I'm fluent in 8 languages: Japanese, English, Spanish, French, Italian, German, Mandarin, and Russian." Gideon Hale opened his mouth and closed it again like a fish pulled from water. Bennett Cross lowered himself back into his chair very slowly, as if his legs could no longer hold him upright. "Before switching to linguistics," Liora continued, her voice now finding a rhythm she thought she'd lost long ago, the rhythm of someone who had once stood before a lecture hall of 300 students without a tremor. "I studied for 2 years at Columbia Business School, majoring in finance. I didn't complete the program, but I learned enough to understand that the 3 translation errors I just pointed out aren't just linguistic mistakes. They're errors that could destroy the entire financial structure of this deal." No one spoke. No one dared to. A multi-million-dollar boardroom with a black oak table and crystal chandeliers was being overtaken by a thin woman in a gray uniform. And the most frightening thing wasn't what she was saying, but the truth that all of them, the most powerful men and women on the East Coast, had walked past her every night for 6 years without ever stopping to ask a simple question. On the screen, Kenji Nakamura spoke in English, his voice slow and deep like a temple bell. "Miss Ashford," he said, his voice filled with a new level of respect, "I'd like to ask you to review this entire contract. Can you do it?" "Yes," Liora answered without a second of hesitation, and the certainty in her voice made Bennett Cross look up at her for the second time that night with the same stunned expression. "How long do you need?" Kenji asked. Liora glanced at the 53-page contract still lying on the table, her eyes quickly measuring the thickness of the appendices and the number of technical clauses. 3 hours, maybe less, but I need to cross-check some port construction terminology to ensure absolute accuracy. "Mr. Nakamura," Vance said, "can you wait until morning?" "I can wait until early morning, New York time," Kenji replied, "but I have one condition. I will only accept a translation prepared by Miss Ashford. No one else." "Agreed," Vance said immediately, then turned to Liora. "What do you need?" And that was when Liora did something no one in the room expected. Not even Selene Kessler, who was beginning to understand that this woman was anything but ordinary. Instead of thanking him, instead of lowering her head, instead of showing gratitude for being given an opportunity, Liora Ashford set her terms. "First," she said, her voice calm as if she were reading a start-of-shift task list, "I need a desk with a computer connected to the internal Steele Holdings system. Second, I need access to all previous project files related to real estate and ports to cross-reference technical terminology. Third, when I finish this translation, I want a private conversation with Mr. Steele." Gideon Hale let out a sound caught somewhere between a laugh and a choke. "The janitor is setting conditions with the boss," he said, but his voice no longer carried its earlier contempt. It was thinner now, weaker, like the voice of someone trying to keep his footing on a listing ship without admitting the deck was already sliding beneath him. Vance didn't look at Gideon. He only looked at Liora, and after 3 seconds of silence in which the entire room forgot how to breathe, he said a single word. "Agreed." Selene stood up immediately. "Liora, you can use my office. I'll take you up and show you how to log into the system." "That won't be necessary," Liora said, and the answer made Selene stop mid-step. "I already know how to use the system. I've watched you log in, search files, and open documents every night for 6 years while I cleaned your keyboards and screens." Selene looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly, and something very rare crossed the face of Steele Holdings' sharpest chief counsel. It wasn't quite a smile, but it came close. The two women left the boardroom together, one in a perfectly tailored dark gray suit and the other in a faded janitorial uniform. Yet their footsteps on the marble corridor just before dawn sounded no different at all. 3 hours later, just before dawn, Liora returned to the boardroom with a stack of papers in her hands. Her eyes were red from lack of sleep, but her back was straight. And when she placed the new translation on the black oak table, her hands didn't shake. Kenji Nakamura had reappeared on the screen, this time with two assistants seated on either side of him, all three wearing reading glasses and each holding a printed copy of the original Japanese contract. Over the next 20 minutes, the three Japanese men read, compared, and discussed in rapid Japanese, pointing to every line, every clause, every figure. Liora sat quietly at the corner of the table, understanding every word they said, but not interrupting, because she knew that silence at the right moment carried more power than any explanation. Finally, Kenji looked up, removed his glasses, and smiled for the second time that night. But this time, it was broader and warmer, transforming his stern face into that of a grandfather looking at a grandchild who had just made him proud. "Perfect," he said in English. "Not a single error. This is exactly what we meant, Miss Ashford. Your translation isn't just correct. It's better than the original produced by our legal team." A collective exhale swept through the boardroom like sea air rushing through an open window. Bennett Cross leaned back, closed his eyes, and cradled his head in his hands like a man who had just survived a car accident. Gideon Hale sat motionless, staring down at the tabletop, and Liora didn't know what he was thinking, but at least he had stopped laughing. Vance Steele stood up. "So do we have a deal?" "We have a deal," Kenji confirmed with a nod. Then he paused, and the word "but" fell from his mouth as lightly as a leaf, yet as heavy as a hammer. Everyone's heart in the room skipped a beat. "I have one condition," Kenji said. "All communication between my company and Steele Holdings from this point forward must go through Miss Ashford. All documents, all calls, all meetings. She's the only one I trust." He looked at Liora through the screen with the sharp eyes of a man who had witnessed enough deceit to recognize truth when it stood in front of him, even when that truth wore a janitor's uniform and rubber-soled shoes. "This project is worth $200 million. We need someone reliable, and tonight, the only reliable person in this room is the one no one bothered to see for 6 years." Vance turned to Liora. His eyes asked the question without his mouth opening. Liora looked back at him, and in that moment, under the boardroom lights just before dawn, amid the smell of cold coffee, paper, and the faint trace of floor cleaner, still clinging to her uniform, she understood that the door had opened and she could no longer pretend she was invisible. After Kenji disconnected and the screen went black, after Bennett Cross quietly gathered the papers with hands that still trembled slightly, after Selena Kessler squeezed Leora's shoulder once and stepped out, after Gideon Hale left the boardroom without saying another word to anyone, Vance Steele rose, buttoned his suit jacket as if he had just finished a battle rather than a meeting, and spoke to Liora in a voice she had never heard him use with anyone in the past 6 years. Not a commanding voice, not a threatening one, but the voice of a man inviting rather than summoning. He said she had asked for a private conversation and told her to follow him. He led her through the corridor on the top floor, past the bulletproof glass doors, into an area Liora had never been allowed to clean for 6 years because Vance had his own private maintenance team, and into his personal office. The room was 3 times larger than the studio apartment she rented in Queens, with dark walnut-paneled walls, a mahogany desk set before floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking the Manhattan skyline just before dawn, the city still glowing below like a carpet woven from light, and in one corner a glass shelving unit holding not books but locked document boxes, each marked with a symbol Liora was wise enough not to ask about. He told her to sit and gestured to the black leather chair in front of the desk, and Liora sat down, still wearing her gray uniform, still carrying the scent of disinfectant on her hands. And she realized she had forgotten to remove the cleaning cloth tucked into her back pocket, its corner sticking out like a silent reminder of who she had been for 6 years, and still was until this very moment. Vance did not sit behind the desk. He pulled out a chair and sat across from her with no desk between them, and that distance closer than any conversation she had ever seen him have with anyone made her understand that this man did not just want answers. He wanted to see the truth on her face as she spoke, as he asked one word, why? And she understood it contained everything. Why someone who had graduated from Columbia, who was fluent in 8 languages, who had studied finance, would choose to push a cleaning cart late at night in the building of a Mafia boss for 6 long years. Liora looked down at her hands, and this time she did not look up right away, because the story she was about to tell was one she had kept in her chest like a wound that never healed, and touching it always hurt like the first time. She said it was her younger brother. His name was Jasper, and when he was 15, doctors found a tumor in his brain. She paused, swallowed, and continued. Her parents had died in a car accident when she was 21, and she was Jasper's only legal guardian. His sister, his father, his mother, everything he had. Vance asked if there had been surgery, and she noticed his voice had changed. No longer sharp or threatening, but flatter and emptier, like the voice of someone forcing emotion down to listen fully. She said it had been experimental surgery, the only option with a chance to save him, not covered by insurance, nearly $400,000 over 3 years. She said the number evenly, like reading a bill. But Vance understood that behind it were 3 years of a woman in her 20s, sleeping no more than 4 hours a day, selling the small apartment her parents had left, selling the car, borrowing from banks, borrowing from friends, even borrowing from loan sharks in Queens she should never have gone near until there was nothing left to sell, no one left to borrow from, and the only thing she still had were her hands and the hours from late at night to early morning that no one else wanted. She said human resources had hired her for the night shift. She worked late at night to early morning, slept 2 hours, took Jasper to the hospital, sat beside his bed during chemotherapy, went home, slept 2 more hours, picked him up, did homework with him, cooked dinner, watched him sleep, then went back to work. She told it without tears, and that was what made it hurt more than any crying could have, because it showed she had told the story to herself so many times that the tears had dried up, and only the bare truth remained like bone. Vance asked how Jasper was now, and Liora realized it was the first question he had asked, not to assess or analyze, but because he truly wanted to know. Her face lit up, and the smile that appeared on her cracked lips was the first smile Vance Steele had ever seen on her, and it changed her completely, as if someone had turned on a light in a room he had thought was always dark. She said he was finally cured, and as a gifted student who had skipped 2 grades. He was now in his final year of an accelerated medical program at New York University, wanting to become a pediatric oncologist to help children who had gone through what he had. Vance said she was proud of him, not as a question. She answered that it had been worth every day, every worn pair of shoes, every sleepless night, every callus on her hands. Vance was silent for a long time. Then he asked the question Liora feared most, whether Jasper knew about the janitor work, about everything she had done for him. She said no, her voice hardening like concrete, that he thought she worked an administrative job and he would never know if she could help it. Vance said nothing more. He looked out the glass as Manhattan shifted from night toward morning. The skyline edged with pale orange in the east, and his hand moved unconsciously to the left pocket of his jacket, where he carried an old silver pocket watch he never showed anyone. Liora did not know who it had belonged to. She did not know it had once been owned by a woman named Margaret, who had played Chopin on a piano in a small Brooklyn apartment before life pushed her into the underworld and never let her return. But she saw that Vance Steele's fingers, The fingers that had signed orders making the entire East Coast tremble were stroking that watch with a tenderness she had never imagined he possessed. And in that moment, in the dim office with dawn creeping across the floor, she caught a glimpse of someone else beneath Vance Steele. Not the boss, not the chief executive, but a son who was still missing his mother. The dawn had climbed halfway up the glass when Vance withdrew his hand from the pocket watch, straightened in his chair, and his face shifted from that rare moment of softness back to its familiar sharpness so quickly that Liora wondered if she had imagined it at all. But she hadn't imagined it. She had seen it. And once something had been seen, it couldn't be pretended away. "Kenji's proposal is real," Vance said, his voice returning to the measured cadence of a man who ran an empire. "He wants you to be the sole point of contact between the two sides. The Atlantic City Port Casino project will last at least 3 years, possibly 5. You'll work directly under me as a special liaison specialist with compensation commensurate with the value you proved tonight." He named a figure. Liora heard it, but it took her a few seconds to process because the number was larger than the total income from 6 years of night cleaning combined, and she almost laughed at the absurdity of it, that the same hands, the same mind, the same person were worth $14 an hour in a gray uniform and worth 100 times that in a boardroom chair. "Before I answer," Liora said, and she saw Vance's eyebrow lift by a millimeter because he wasn't used to making an offer that wasn't accepted immediately. "I have conditions." "More conditions," Vance said, but his tone wasn't irritated. It was almost amused, the way a chess player reacts when an opponent makes a move he didn't anticipate. "First," Liora said, "I want to continue cleaning a few hours each week." Vance looked at her as if she'd said she wanted to be paid in candy. "You've just been offered a position people need a Harvard degree to apply for, and you want to keep mopping floors because that's where people tell the truth," Liora replied. "No one guards their words around a janitor, Mr. Steele. No one keeps secrets from someone they think doesn't exist. For 6 years, I've known more about this building than any security camera. And if you want me to be truly useful, then let me keep my ears where people drop their armor." Vance was silent, and Liora realized he wasn't silent in objection, but in calculation. And when Vance Steele calculated, it meant she'd said something he found valuable. "And the second condition," she continued, "is far more important." "Go on." "I'm not the only one," Liora said, and her voice shifted. No longer the voice of someone negotiating for herself, but the voice of someone speaking for those without one. "In this building right now, there are at least 15 people doing jobs that don't reflect their true abilities, and no one has bothered to ask why. For example," Vance said, his eyes narrowing, "Mira, the cook in the basement, the woman Mr. Hale calls the old kitchen hag," Liora said, and her voice sharpened on the phrase. "She was once the head chef at the Walden, a Michelin-starred restaurant in Brooklyn. She left because her ex-husband was abusive. She had to disappear, needed somewhere he couldn't find her, so she took a night kitchen job here, and no one asked who she was before." Vance said nothing. Liora went on, "Franklin in logistics, 63 years old, the man you call the old warehouse guy. He was a chief accountant for 20 years at a midtown financial firm before he was laid off, and no one rehired him because they said he was too old, even though he can read a balance sheet faster than anyone on the 47th floor. And Naya," she said, the night receptionist most people here don't even know by name. "She graduated in architecture from Pratt Institute, but when her husband had a stroke 2 years ago, she needed a job with flexible hours so she could work and care for him. And the night desk here was the only thing she could find." The room fell silent. The morning light now spread across the center of the floor, splitting the office into 2 halves, one dark and one bright. And Liora sat exactly on that line, as if she had lived her entire life on the boundary between being seen and unseen. "I want a program," she said. "Not charity, not handouts, but discovery. Find the people in this building whose abilities are being wasted. Give them a chance to prove themselves. Let them be part of decisions instead of only cleaning up the consequences of those decisions. Vance stood, walked to the glass, and looked out at Manhattan, waking below. Millions of people beginning a new day, and he stood there long enough that Liora thought he would refuse. Then he turned back. "You just saved me a $200 million deal," he said slowly, word by word. "You uncovered a sabotage scheme my entire security apparatus missed. You translated a contract 12 experts failed to handle. And when I ask what you want, instead of asking for money, for titles, for anything for yourself, you ask for a cook, an old logistics clerk, and a night receptionist." He paused, looking at her, and in those bottomless dark eyes, Liora saw something she couldn't name, but that made her hold her breath. "Why?" Liora stood, and for the first time in the conversation, she smiled. Not the bright smile she'd worn when speaking of Jasper, but the quiet smile of someone who had walked through enough darkness to know what she needed and what she didn't. "Because my brother is alive, Mr. Steele. He's healthy. He's about to become a doctor. He has a future. I have everything I need. But the people I just told you about, they're still waiting." 3 days after that night, Liora left Summit Tower early in the morning as usual. But today, she wasn't heading out from a cleaning shift. She had just finished her first work session as a special liaison specialist, sitting in the new office Selene had arranged for her on the 45th floor, reviewing the entire Nakamura contract appendix one last time before sending it to Tokyo. And she was so exhausted that her gray-green eyes saw everything through a thin veil of haze. She walked toward the subway station at Fulton Street like every other morning, 3 train lines back to Queens, about 45 minutes if there were no delays. But when she turned into the shortcut alley between 42nd Avenue and Morrison Street that she always used because it saved 5 minutes, she sensed immediately that something was wrong. 2 men stood at the end of the alley, backs against the brick wall, hands buried in their jacket pockets, and the way they stood told her at once they weren't homeless men looking for a place to sleep. They were waiting, and they were waiting for her. Liora stopped. Instinct told her to turn back, but when she glanced over her shoulder, a third man was already standing at the entrance behind her, blocking the way out. 6 years of walking home in the early hours through dark streets in Manhattan and Queens had taught her how to read situations, and this situation said she wasn't getting away. The taller man stepped forward, his face hidden beneath a low-pulled baseball cap, and he didn't speak. He just held out a brown envelope. Liora took it, her hand steady, and she wondered whether that was because she was brave or because she was too used to being cornered with no one coming to help. She opened the envelope. Inside were 3 photographs. The first showed Jasper walking out of the NYU hospital where he was interning, backpack on his shoulder, headphones on, a smile on his face, unaware that someone was standing across the street with a telephoto lens aimed at him. The second showed Jasper sitting in a cafe on the corner of Bleecker Street, head bent over a book, a latte in front of him, and the reflection of the photographer clearly visible in the glass behind his shoulder. The third was the one that made Liora feel as if the air had been ripped from her lungs. A photograph of the front door of her studio apartment in Queens with handwritten words in red ink on the back that read that the Nakamura contract was not to be signed, that her brother's eyes looked very much like hers, and that it would be a shame if those eyes never opened again. The taller man withdrew his hand from his jacket, and Liora caught the flash of metal at his waistband. Not a knife, but a handgun tucked into the back of his pants, shown just enough for her to see, just enough for her to understand this wasn't an empty threat. He said it was just a message, his voice low and calm, the voice of someone who had done this many times, and that she was smart and knew what to do. Then all 3 of them vanished into the darkness as quickly as they had appeared, leaving Liora alone in the alley, the 3 photographs in her hands, her heart pounding hard enough to shatter her ribs. But she didn't run home, and she didn't call the police because 6 years living in the shadow of the Steele syndicate had taught her that the police didn't solve this kind of problem. She turned back towards Summit Tower. 20 minutes later, she stood outside the door to Vance Steele's office just before dawn, not knocking but pushing it open. And she wasn't surprised to find him still there, sitting in the darkness, the only light in the room coming from Manhattan, street lights filtering through the glass and the amber glow of a whiskey glass on the desk. Because Liora knew Vance Steele never slept before dawn, she'd cleaned this area long enough to know. She didn't speak. She simply walked to the desk and laid the 3 photographs on the mahogany surface. Vance looked down at them. The first, the second, the third. She watched his hand tighten around the whiskey glass, his knuckles turning white. Then he set the glass down very slowly. So slowly she knew that if he lost control, it would shatter in his hand. He picked up the phone, dialed a single number, and spoke 4 words in a voice Liora had never heard before. Not cold, not angry, but something deeper and darker than both combined. The voice of a man drawing a line that no one crossed and returned from. He said to protect the boy. He ended the call, looked at Liora, and said in a calm voice that his eyes didn't match because they were burning, that within an hour, her brother would have 24-hour protection he would never know existed, that no one would touch him, no one. Liora stood there looking at him, and she saw something. 6 years of cleaning this building had never shown her. The anger of Vance Steele, not the cold fury when a deal collapsed, not the controlled anger when an employee made a mistake, but a hot, primal rage igniting in dark eyes because someone had dared to threaten something he had for reasons neither he nor she yet understood, decided to protect. He said the Caruso family from Chicago wanted the Atlantic City casino deal, that they had planted people in the interpreter team to sabotage the Nakamura contract, and when she broke their plan that night, she became a target. He turned back to her, the rising dawn behind him, forming a bright outline around his dark silhouette, making him look like a figure cut from light or from shadow, depending on where she stood. He told her this wasn't business anymore, and it was the first time he used her name. Not Miss Ashford, not a formal address, but Liora. And the way it sounded in his low voice was nothing like the way anyone else ever said it. He said this was war. 1 week passed and Summit Tower still stood solid in the middle of Manhattan, as if nothing had happened. But inside its marble walls and bulletproof glass, everything had changed. Liora Ashford now had her own office on the 45th floor, a small room at the end of the corridor that had once been an old record storage space, which Selene Kessler cleared out in a single afternoon. And when Liora stepped inside for the first time, she stood there for a long while looking at the desk, the swivel chair, the widescreen computer, and the small plaque outside the door engraved with her name in brass. Then she looked down at her hands, the calluses still there, the skin still cracked at the middle knuckles, and she thought how strange it was that the same hands could wring out a floor rag in the early hours and sign emails to the largest investment conglomerate in Japan in the afternoon. The talent discovery program began quietly, without announcements or fanfare, exactly as Liora wanted. She met each person individually, Mira first, then Franklin, then Nia, then 8 others she had silently taken note of over 6 years of cleaning, and every conversation took place in the basement employee break room, over a cup of vending machine coffee, a place no one from senior management ever set foot in. Mira cried when Liora asked whether she wanted to cook again. Franklin went silent for a long time when asked if he could take a look at the logistics system just once. And Nia, the night receptionist, said only one sentence, that she had thought no one knew she had ever been an architect. Gideon Hale said nothing publicly. He still attended meetings, still sat in his old seat, still wore his 3-piece gray suit. But Liora sensed his discomfort the way one senses old cigarette smoke clinging to curtains, unseen but unmistakably there. He never looked directly at her in meetings, always speaking to Selene or Bennett when he needed to refer to her work, as if by refusing to acknowledge her presence, he could turn her invisible again. But Liora was used to being ignored. 6 years had been a long training course, and she knew Gideon wasn't dangerous, just a man nearing 60, watching the world he understood slowly disappear beneath his feet without knowing how to adapt. That evening, close to late night, Liora was still sitting in her new office, rereading the technical appendix on port design that Kenji had sent that afternoon. Her eyes tired, but her mind clear because 6 years of night shifts had trained her body to function while the rest of the world slept. She didn't hear footsteps. Vance Steele moved more quietly than anyone she had ever known for a man of his height. And when she looked up, he was already standing in the doorway holding 2 paper cups of coffee from the machine at the end of the corridor. Coffee Liora knew he had never poured for anyone else in this building. He didn't speak. He set 1 cup in front of her, kept 1 for himself, then sat down in the chair opposite her desk, opened a folder he had brought, and began to read. Liora looked at him for a second, then returned to her own documents, and so they sat facing each other in the small room at the end of the 45th floor corridor, reading, taking notes, occasionally drinking coffee without a word. And the silence wasn't heavy or tense. It was the kind of silence between 2 people who didn't need words to feel each other's presence. And Liora realized this was the first time in 6 years she hadn't been alone late at night in this building. Near dawn, Vance closed his folder, stood up, and walked to the door. He stopped, his back to her, 1 hand resting on the doorframe, and spoke without turning around. He said she wasn't afraid of him. It wasn't a question, but it wasn't quite a statement either. It sat somewhere in between, where curiosity met confusion, because Vance Steele had lived his entire life in a world where everyone feared him, and someone who didn't was something he had no formula to deal with. Liora lifted her gaze from the papers, looked at the broad back in the black suit, the faint scar on the left side of his neck just visible above the collar, and she answered in a voice so calm it was almost indifferent. But it wasn't. It was the voice of someone life had beaten until there was nothing left to fear. She said she had spent 3 years sitting beside a hospital bed, watching her brother fight death every single day. She had walked home in the early hours through streets even taxis wouldn't drive. She had eaten 1 meal a day for 6 months to afford medical bills, and she had survived things far more frightening than him, Mr. Steele. Vance remained at the door, his back still turned, but Liora saw his shoulders dip slightly. Not much, just a millimeter, like a concrete wall developing a tiny crack you had to look very closely to see. But she saw it because 6 years of being invisible had turned her into the sharpest observer in the building. Then he turned his head just a fraction, enough for her to see one side of his face in the corridor light, and on lips usually drawn straight as a pencil line appeared something Liora had never seen in 6 years. A smile so small it almost didn't exist, so fleeting she would have missed it if she had blinked. But she didn't blink, and she saw it. The first crack in Vance Steele's armor. And she knew that crack, no matter how small, would never heal again. 2 weeks after that smile, on a heavy rain afternoon that made Manhattan look submerged behind a blurred pane of glass, Selene Kessler knocked on Liora's office door, stepped inside, closed it behind her, and sat in the chair opposite the desk without saying a word for nearly a full minute. Liora knew how to wait. 6 years of silence had taught her that sometimes the best thing she could give someone was the space to find their first sentence. "My mother once sat exactly where you're sitting," Selene finally said, her voice steady, though her eyes were not, their rims red as if she'd cried before coming and wiped it away hurriedly in the elevator. Not this spot, not this office, but a chair like this in a building like this late at night, mopping floors, emptying trash cans, scrubbing toilets so that the next morning I'd have money to go to school. Liora set her pen down. She worked 3 jobs, Selene continued, staring out the window where the rain was drawing vertical lines across the glass like bars. Night janitor in an office building on 56th Street, morning prep cook at a small diner near Penn Station, afternoon laundry work at a laundromat in Hell's Kitchen. She slept 4 hours a day, sometimes 3, sometimes 2, for 12 years so I could get into law school, so I could sit at that desk. Celine gestured toward her own office at the end of the corridor. "And when I graduated, when I got the offer from Steele Holdings, she didn't come to the ceremony because she was on shift at the laundromat and couldn't get time off. And I know she cried alone at home that night because a neighbor told me later, but she never said a word to me." "Is she still alive?" Liora asked softly. Celine shook her head. 5 years ago, lung cancer. She never smoked, but 30 years breathing cleaning chemicals in closed rooms gets you the same result. The silence between the two women was heavier than the rain outside, but it wasn't cold. It was warm in the way only those who had walked the same dark road could feel when they recognized each other. "She lived long enough to see you succeed," Liora said. "She did." Celine nodded, but she didn't live long enough to see a grandchild. "I don't have children, Liora. I tried for years, but she stopped, swallowed, and Liora saw Celine's chin tremble slightly, a gesture the sharpest chief counsel at Steele Holdings would never allow anyone else to witness, but Liora did, and it was enough. "My body wouldn't let me." "Celine," Liora said gently. "Last week I met with a social worker," Celine said, her voice now truly shaking, unable to hide it. "There's a little girl, 8 years old, who lost both parents in an apartment fire in the Bronx last month. She's in temporary care and needs a family, and I keep thinking about what my mother would say if she were still alive. And I know exactly what she'd say. She'd say, 'Celine, I raised you alone with 3 jobs. You can raise 1 child with love.'" Liora stood, walked around the desk, and wrapped her arms around Celine Kessler, the coldest, sharpest woman on the 45th floor, and Celine held on in return, gripping Liora's back like a drowning person clinging to a lifeline. And they stood that way in the small room at the end of the corridor, while the rain poured down on Manhattan outside. 2 women taught the same lesson by life through different paths. "Your mother would be proud," Liora whispered. "Do it, Celine. The child needs you." That afternoon, close to evening, when most employees had gone home and the 45th floor was nearly empty, Liora's phone vibrated. She looked at the screen and smiled instantly, the kind of smile no one at Summit Tower had ever seen on her face. Wide, warm, unguarded, the smile of an older sister. She stepped into the corridor to take the call, unaware that Vance's office was only 3 doors away and that its door was open. "Hey, kid," she said, her voice so gentle that if anyone at Summit Tower heard it without seeing her, they wouldn't believe this was the same woman who had faced Vance Steele and pressed on without blinking. "I know. Don't worry, I'm eating properly. Yes, that's a lie, but lying out of love hurts less than the truth. Did you remember to take your supplements? What did the doctor say about this month's results?" "Good. That's great. I'm so proud of you. You know that. I'm always proud of you." She laughed softly at something Jasper said on the other end. "Yes, I promise I'll come by this weekend. I'll cook that pasta you like. Yes, the one with truffles Mom used to make. I remember the recipe. I remember everything." Her voice dipped on the last sentence, and she turned her face to the wall, one hand pressing to her eye. Because sometimes remembering everything wasn't a gift but a burden. "Love you, kid. Study hard." She ended the call, took a long breath, rubbed her face, set her smile back into place like putting a mask on again, then turned and froze. Vance Steele stood in the doorway of his office, fewer than 10 steps away, holding a folder on his way to a meeting, and she knew instantly from the way he stood and the way he looked at her that he'd heard it. Not all of it, but enough. They faced each other across the empty corridor at evening, the last sunlight slanting through the western windows, casting a long band of light across the marble floor between them, and Vance spoke in a voice she recognized at once. The same voice he'd used in the dark office that night when she told him about Jasper. Not cold, not threatening, just flat and hollow, like a room someone had emptied of furniture. "He doesn't know anything, does he? About all of it? About the janitor work, about this building, about what you've done?" It wasn't a question, it was a statement, and it was correct. "That's right," Liora said, "and you'll keep that secret." The words left her mouth before she could think, and they both heard it. They both understood it. She had called him you. Not Mr. Steele, not sir, but you. A tiny word that shifted the distance between them more than any $200 million contract ever could. Vance didn't correct her. He didn't remind her of proper address. He simply nodded once slowly, then stepped across the strip of sunlight on the floor, past her, and walked toward the conference room. But as he passed, Liora caught the scent of black coffee and sandalwood and something she couldn't name, something that stayed with her through that night and many nights after. And she knew that one small word had changed something neither of them was ready to name. 3 months passed faster than Liora expected, or perhaps time always moved faster when someone was busy living rather than merely surviving. And on a Friday morning in early December, when Manhattan lay under a thin veil of early winter mist, the main boardroom on the top floor of Summit Tower looked entirely different from that night when 12 interpreters failed and a janitor stepped through the oak doors. Today, the doors stood wide open, the table was draped in white cloth, champagne bottles lined silver trays, and the people seated around the table no longer wore sweat on their brows or desperation in their eyes. They laughed, they shook hands, they raised their glasses because the Nakamura deal was complete. $200 million officially signed, and Steele Holdings had just entered the largest phase in the company's history. On the massive screen, Kenji Nakamura sat in Tokyo in a light gray suit with his 2 assistants at his sides. But today he smiled from beginning to end, and when he spoke, the room fell silent. Not out of fear as it had that night, but out of respect. He said he wanted to announce something. That Nakamura Group had decided to expand the project not only in Atlantic City, but across the entire east coast of the United States from Boston to Miami, and that he wished to offer Miss Ashford the position of Director of Communications for the entire partnership program. Liora stood at the corner of the room, holding a champagne glass she had not yet sipped from, and she felt every eye turn toward her. But this time, it was nothing like that night. There was no contempt, no doubt, only acknowledgement, and she had to press her emotions down deep to keep her face composed, because this was the first time in 6 years she stood in this room without a mop in her hands. But the ceremony was not only for her. Selene stood, invited Mira, Franklin, Nia, and 8 others from the talent program to enter the boardroom, and as they passed through the oak doors, Liora saw Mira's hands trembling, saw Franklin standing straighter than she had ever seen him in logistics, saw Nia wearing the nicest blouse she owned and constantly smoothing her hair because she did not know where to put her hands. Franklin stepped up to Liora holding a small wooden plaque that she immediately recognized as handmade, because Franklin was the kind of man who did everything by hand and believed what was made by one's own hands carried more meaning than anything bought with money. And engraved on it were the words that said it was for Liora Ashford, the person who taught them that a person's value did not lie in the uniform they wore, but in the heart they carried. Liora took the plaque with both hands, her calloused fingers tracing each carved letter, and she did not cry, but Selene saw her chin tremble, and Selene understood. Vance stood at the head of the table, watching in silence, and when everyone settled, he spoke. He said Steele Holdings would establish a charitable foundation to support families facing medical hardship, funded from the profits of the Nakamura project, and that Liora Ashford would serve as chair of the foundation. Liora looked at him, and he looked back. And in a room full of people, that gaze lingered longer than necessary for a business announcement, though no one noticed except Selene, who always saw what others missed. Liora said she accepted, but with one condition, and Gideon Hale, who had learned over 3 months that whenever Liora Ashford said the word condition, it was best to stay quiet and listen, remained still in his chair. She said the first family the foundation supported had to be the Benson family. Bennett Cross asked who Benson was. Liora said he was a night security guard, 60 years old, had worked here 7 years without taking a single day off. And right now, he was selling the only car he owned, selling his late wife's wedding ring, borrowing from loan sharks on the street to pay for surgery for his granddaughter, a 5-year-old girl with a congenital heart condition, and no one in the building knew because no one had asked. Silence followed, the kind of silence Liora knew well. The silence of people just reminded that they had failed to see someone in pain. Vance said, agreed without meetings, without votes, without needing anyone's consent. On the screen, Kenji Nakamura removed his glasses, and when he spoke, his voice carried something different, no longer that of an investor, but of a man who had lived more than 60 years and had not forgotten where he came from. He told Miss Ashford he wanted to share something, that when he first saw her in a janitor's uniform speaking flawless Japanese that night, she reminded him of his mother, a truly brilliant mathematician who could solve differential equations in her head faster than others could add and subtract. But after the war, when his family lost everything, she became a seamstress to raise 4 children, sitting at a sewing machine from morning to night for 20 years without a single complaint. And she taught him that intelligence and dignity could hide in places no one expected, and seeing Liora tonight, he knew she had been right. Liora smiled at the screen and thanked him, saying it meant more to her than he might think. After everyone gradually left, after Mira carried the last slice of cake home for her grandson, after Franklin squeezed Leora's hand so long she had to pat his back to make him let go, after Celine winked at her from the end of the corridor and disappeared into the elevator, Vance stepped closer to Liora. Closer than usual, close enough for her to catch the familiar scent of black coffee and sandalwood. And he spoke very softly, only for the two of them to hear, saying the Caruso family had been handled. 4 words, no explanation, no details. And Liora did not ask, because she had lived in his world long enough to know that handled in Vance Steele's vocabulary did not mean the same thing it did in everyone else's, and she realized she was not afraid of that. She was not repulsed. She did not judge, and it was precisely that absence of judgment that kept her awake at 3 a.m. in her Queen's studio, wondering how much 6 years in the shadow of the Steele syndicate had changed her, and whether the part she had lost was the part she needed to lose in order to survive. 2 years after the night when 2 hands touched in the darkness of the Summit Tower conference room, Liora Ashford stood on the stage of an auditorium in Philadelphia before 300 people, not in a faded gray uniform, not holding a mop and a glass cleaner, but wearing a dark blue blazer Celine had helped her choose, and leather shoes she still wasn't used to because her feet remembered worn rubber soles more clearly. And when the stage lights shone into her eyes, she remembered the fluorescent lights in the early hours in the corridors of Summit Tower, the lights that 6 years earlier only she and her cleaning cart had passed beneath. The charitable foundation she chaired had helped more than 200 families in 2 years. Mr. Benson's granddaughter had undergone successful surgery and was now in 1st grade. The Talent Discovery Program had expanded to 17 other companies along the East Coast. Mira was now running culinary operations for the entire Steele Holdings building system, with menus praised by New York food magazines. Franklin had restructured logistics to save the company more than $2 million a year, and Nia was leading the interior architectural design team for the Nakamura project in Atlantic City. But Liora didn't list those figures on stage. She told a story. The story of a janitor pushing a cleaning cart late at night and accidentally whispering Japanese through a half-open door. When she finished, a woman in the 5th row raised her hand, silver-haired, about 55 years old, her voice trembling slightly, and asked directly whether Liora wasn't angry, whether 6 years of cleaning offices and being invisible while holding 8 languages and a Columbia degree didn't feel like a waste. Liora looked at the woman and saw the real question in her eyes, not about Liora, but about herself, about the years she had felt overlooked. And Liora said she hadn't wasted anything, that she had spent 6 years learning humility, endurance, and what truly mattered in life. That every night pushing a cleaning cart through marble corridors taught her her worth didn't lie in the clothes she wore or the title on a door plaque, but in how she treated people and in the choices she was willing to sacrifice everything to make. And if she regretted anything, it was only that it had taken her too long to reclaim her voice, though perhaps she needed all those silent years, so that when she finally spoke, she had something worth saying. After the talk, a young woman of about 22, ponytail, wrinkled t-shirt, canvas backpack on her shoulder, shyly approached and said her name was Phoebe, that she was studying education, but worked at a laundromat by day to pay tuition, and often felt invisible, as if her job erased her value. Liora took Phoebe's hand, held it firmly, looked into her eyes, and saw herself 7 years earlier, exhausted, alone, hands cracked by chemicals, eyes red from lack of sleep, yet refusing to quit, and told Phoebe there was no job without value, only a society that hadn't recognized the value of every job. That ironing clothes by day and studying by night didn't diminish her worth, but proved she had more of it than anyone who never had to fight for education. And she told her never to forget that. Phoebe cried, thanked her, and walked away. And Liora watched her disappear through the auditorium doors, thinking this was the real reason she had spoken up that night, not to save a $200 million deal, but so that one day a girl named Phoebe would know she wasn't invisible. On the flight back to New York that evening, Liora sat by the window watching white clouds below when her phone buzzed with a message from Vance, asking whether she wanted to coordinate Nakamura's expansion into Europe, London, Paris, Berlin. And she smiled and replied yes, but that she needed to bring a team because she knew some very capable people still waiting for an opportunity. And his reply came immediately telling her to hire whoever she wanted, followed a second later by another message unrelated to work, unrelated to Nakamura or Europe or money. Just 4 words that 2 years earlier, Vance Steele would have bitten his tongue rather than write, telling her to message him when she got home. Liora looked at those 4 words and smiled, not the smile of a communications director, not the smile of a foundation chair, not the smile of an 8-language Columbia graduate, but the smile of someone who had walked through 6 years of darkness and finally found someone who truly saw her. Not because she translated contracts or saved deals, but because he looked into gray-green eyes no one had bothered to look into for 6 years, and saw something that frightened him more than any enemy, something called hope. The next morning, as Liora walked through the 45th floor corridor of Summit Tower, she saw a young man pushing a cleaning cart, gray uniform, new rubber soles, posture slightly hunched from unfamiliar night shifts, and she stopped, greeted him by name, asked how the job was going, told him to come to her any time if he needed anything, and smiled as she walked on, knowing that in a few months she would ask him about his past, his dreams, the skills he was hiding behind the gray uniform, because the most important lesson of her life came from 6 years pushing a cart through corridors where no one saw her. That behind every seemingly invisible person is a story waiting to be discovered. That a person's value never lies in the uniform they wear or the chair they sit on, but in the heart they carry and how they choose to treat the world. That sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't to shout in a crowd, but to whisper at the right moment when no one expects you to have a voice. And that sometimes, just sometimes, a whispered sentence in Japanese from a janitor through a half-open door can change everything. And I mean everything. That is the story of Liora Ashford, the 8-language janitor of Summit Tower. And now I want to hear your story. How did this story make you feel? Have you ever felt invisible? Do you know someone living a life that doesn't reflect who they truly are? Share with me in the comments. I read everyone, and I genuinely want to hear what's in your heart, because every story deserves to be told, and every person deserves to be seen. If this story touched you, please like it, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more stories like this every day. I wish you and those you love good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye, and I'll see you in the next video.